the higher latitudes and push storm tracks further south in Chile into Patagonia. There are many complex interactions with teleconnections like SAM and ENSO and PBO, but generally speaking, this expansion of the Hadley cell is going to push more storms further south away from central Chile and make it drier here. We're already seeing that happen right now. But this is a very large-scale phenomenon that the basic first principles of physics is going to have a big effect here and also in the southwestern United States. So the end effect, if you look at the models that use this information, you can see the Hadley cell produces more precipitation in most of the equatorial regions, and then you get a drying where you have the subsidence of those cells, both in much of central Chile and also in the northern latitudes, Mexico into the southwestern US and parts of Europe. So where it's wet, it's going to get much wetter, and where it's dry, it's going to get drier. It's going to be difficult to escape this phenomenon. So just another way to present this, you can see this is the equator, 40 degrees and 80 degrees. You can see we have much more precipitation on either side of the equator. And then it gets very dry near 40 degrees in both the north and the southern hemisphere. And then again wet at higher latitudes. The models are very certain about this, but when you get to a fine scale, it's difficult to, both spatially and temporally, you can't say, well, this piece of land is going to get drier, but generally speaking, these latitudinal trends are going to continue. We also expect more extreme climate events, which is very important because both in Chile and in northern United States, we can even have maybe more rain in one storm event. But over the year, you look at maybe less events of rain, but more rain in that one event. So what does that mean? During the fire season, if you have 2 rain events with 20 or 50 or 100 millimeters of rain, it's very different than if you have 20 rain events with 5 millimeters each or 3 millimeters each. That would suppress fire more than just having 1 event or 2 events. So the extreme nature of precipitation could have a lot of ecological significance and also for how much fire we have. And just another, the number of dry days could increase. They're saying, upwards of 30 dry days with very little precipitation in the future per year. And that's a lot. That will have a lot of consequences for ecosystems if you add 30 more days without rain or very little rain. So I will talk about the consequences of these large-scale trends briefly for Chile, and then more for Montana. And this is part of a project that Anibal, Bouchard, and I wrote some grants, and then we started working with Mauro and Thomas Veblen and some others here listed here. It was a really nice group in Rafael. And we published 1 paper so far. So this is we used MODIS satellite imagery of the fires that have occurred from 2000 to 2017. We compared that with the CONAF fire records, and you can see the fires across the central region. We have 1 fire, it's just red, and then many fires is the yellow and black. And in 2017, many of these areas burned. When we look at the general patterns of fire and we use models to explain why we see these patterns. It's not surprising. Biophysical conditions come out as the most important. The density of populated areas and the type of fuels. What we see at any given year, you see from 2000 to 2017, you see, not a lot of fire each year, and it is very spatially diverse or heterogeneous across the landscape. And in 2017, we have record-breaking fires, of course, that impacted much of central Chile. And when we model, we use the information on how these fires were distributed across the landscape. It's not surprising that the type of fuel is very important for explaining where we see fire. We see lower elevation areas with plantations and matorral being highly flammable and have the highest probability of fire. And intermediate areas of population density. So where you have some people, but not so many that people are putting fires out, and so few that you don't have ignitions. So it's the middle area where humans are, we accidentally light fires or intentionally light fires. So where you have an intermediate amount of people is where you have the highest number of ignitions. So this is also an important factor. So I'm just going to highlight one of the results from this work, other than the general patterns that we characterize. Vegetation came out as really an incredibly important variable influencing where a fire will occur or where fires will spread. We found that, given that the proportion of the landscape covered by these different fuel types or vegetation types, the proportionate area burned was much higher for pine plantations and eucalyptus plantations than the amount of the landscape that they cover. So you can see much of this land here was converted to plantations starting in the 1970s. You had different waves of land conversion to provide pulp for the mills. And this conversion has influenced the probability or likelihood of fire in this region. And we look at this foraging index. So this is a preference. Does fire have a preference for one of these vegetation types? And you can see plantation forests, mixed bosque nativo and exotica and sclerophyll forest and matorral. Fire has a preference for spreading in these types of fuels. So that is something to keep in mind that I think it's going to continue in the future, is that with this much flammable vegetation on the landscape, plus you have higher temperatures and ignitions, there's a recipe for a lot of fire activity. So with climate, we talked about some of the very large-scale drivers of changing climate in Chile, and René Garreau and Bossier and others have documented some significant drying trends that are partially affected by this Hadley cell expansion. And this, we have the mega drought or extended drought that occurred in the last decade, and that is expected to continue in the future. And this is combining with very complicated interactions with that Antonio and others have thought about for a long time. The ENSO and PDO and SAM. And rather than make a fool out of myself, I will just say I'm not going to try to explain the complex interactions between the Hadley cell, but we know that with ENSO and with a positive PDO and a positive SAM, what you get is oscillations between wet years and dry years. And for fire, this provides great conditions for fuel development and then drying for fires to spread. So the combination of the teleconnections and the Hadley cell expansion provides you a nice recipe for growing fuels, growing fine fuels and woody fuels, and then drying them out so that you can burn them. So another thing I just will highlight, Mauro has shown in a few regions in central Chile that we are seeing an increase in ignitions as people spread across the landscape. You generally get more ignitions until people are suppressing fires because of intensive agriculture or urbanization. So it's kind of this unimodal relationship where you have more ignitions and then fewer when you have more people. But generally speaking, in outside of urban areas, we have more ignitions. So I will just highlight the ingredients. If you add them up, you get, this is what we should expect. In central Chile, much of the central Chilean region, with all of these ingredients, we should expect to see larger fires into the future. And this is what we are seeing in the western United States as well. It's the same, we have the same ingredients, a different history, but this is what we're dealing with in California, and Oregon, Montana, Colorado, Washington. So I'm now going to switch and talk a little bit about Montana, but I will just ask, are there any questions about the first part? Or need for clarification? Okay. So I do a lot of research in Montana, and I have graduate students working in most parts of the state. This student is working on how bison influence vegetation and fire activity. He's working all over eastern Montana. I have working on a project looking at the last 10,000 years of human use of the alpine environment. We're covering a lot of data from melting ice patches, snowfields. We're looking at the lagomorph, this American pika, and how it's responding to climate change because it lives in a very precarious alpine environment, which is very sensitive. We call, I think I know you have some species you call sentinels of change, or so American pika is our sentinel of climate change. And then I'm working on several projects that are using dendrochronology and paleoecology to reconstruct fire histories for this part of Montana and looking at how fire regimes are changing with climate change. So like Chile, we have increasing temperatures, and with more extreme temperature days, we have more fires. This trend is likely to continue. There's been a lot of research documenting that controls precipitation and temperature, leading to increased fire burned or area burned in the western United States. And if you look at just the models, these are the different states in the United States. And this is the median percent change in area burned in any given year. And for my state, Montana, we're looking at 1,000% increase. So a lot of more fire activity. And the same with Idaho, New Mexico, Nevada, Washington. Much of the West is expected to increase over 500% of the amount area burned in any given year. And now we are seeing the scale of fires. We have always had fires, but the scale, this is a satellite image of smoke. And this is an example from the end of our fire season. And what is maybe a little different in the last 4 decades is that we used to, if we had a wet winter, we maybe had no fires in Montana and we didn't have any smoke. But now, if we have a wet winter here and no fires, we can get smoke from California or Oregon or even the Yukon coming all the way down. So the scale, in any given year, we can have smoke from all over the continent. And that is something that we see an inflection point, an increase from 1980. This type of scale is increased dramatically. This is a fire in Montana, fairly large, and I'll just show you. This is a time-lapse video of this fire, and this is one day. So one day of this fire. This is by University of Montana. So these are difficult fires to fight, even with lots of resources. Even if you have many people and many planes, it's difficult to slow down something with high winds, warm temperatures, and plenty of fuel. So this obviously has a lot of risk for the community here, and it's something we see in Chile and in much of the western United States. So we're starting to think, how do we live with these types of fires if they become more common? What can we do? We also don't want to put people at risk to go into these fires. You have to watch them and protect homes, but you don't want to send somebody trying into the middle of this. So just an example of the kinds of fires we're having. Last year we had Rice Ridge Fire, again, which was right north of University of Montana, 65,000 hectares. It was a very severe fire. It was still patchy across the landscape. It was quite a mosaic, but it created a lot of smoke. A lot of people became sick from the smoke. And we were not prepared to help people with the smoke. I think it's something we should not be surprised when these happen now, and we need as a community to better prepare for the air quality, to help people find places they can go that the smoke is not so bad. You can see the intensity varied, but there's a lot of highly intense, high mortality, and areas where it was lighter. The maple fire, how many people have been to Yellowstone? Anybody been to Yellowstone National Park? Do you know what kind of trees are all over? The Pinus contorta is the most common lodgepole pine. And we typically, I think most people assume that lodgepole pine, because of the paleo records that we get, we assume they only burn every 200 or 300 years. So we had a fire in 1988 that burned several 100,000 hectares, a good chunk of Yellowstone National Park. And we assume, okay, the lodgepole pine is now young. We have young seedlings. It's been, over 30 years. People assume these are very wet seedlings that they can't burn very well, or the saplings. They're in densities of over 500,000 trees per hectare. the seedlings, like you were mentioning. But last year, in 2016, we had one of these stands, very dense lodgepole pine, Pinus contorta, burn again. And I think it surprised many people who said, well, the paleo record suggests these only burn once every 300 years or 200 years. Why is it burning in 30 years again? I will show you, the last video I'll show you is this fire. Monica Turner's lab took this image.
With big fires.
This is Monica Turner speaking, if you've ever, she studies fire.
When the fires came through, we were interested in measuring what we call the severity of the fire, but what was the effect on the ecosystem? And
so this is the maple fire.
That the severity could be
so these are young 35-year-old trees.
The of the tree and all of the down wood very close to each other.
So, yeah, they're not supposed to burn, according to.
We've also been measuring the little baby tree seeds.
But you can see the severity of the burn. It consumed a lot of material and did not leave much.
An area of blackened soil.
What's the things that we can do for measuring bird
So why do I show you that? Well, I think the main reason that these stands did not burn in the past is that the fire season was very short. We have a long winter. Yellowstone is high in elevation, so you have very few warm days and days to dry the fuels. But now we have many more warm days, the fuels getting drier with high winds. Now these fuels can burn, and so we should expect Yellowstone to be burning more frequently, these lodgepole pine stands. And so this kind of leads into one of my students' work. As part of the Rice Ridge Fire, a lot of high elevation forests burned, which is again, these historically did not burn very often. And we're seeing more of our higher elevation species be influenced by fire activity. And so I have a project looking at, or a couple of projects looking at whitebark pine, Pinus albicollis, and we work with people that have studied whitebark pine, but Bob Keene and others from the Fire Lab in Missoula, and we're working with the tribes, the indigenous groups from the Flathead Indian Reservation. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai are very interested in whitebark pine. It's a very important cultural resource. And surprisingly, we don't know much about the fire regime of whitebark pine. We know something, but there are not many good records, ecological records for whitebark pine. We have some, but it's sparse, and so we're trying to augment this. It's a very interesting species. It has large piñones, similar to Araucaria, and I will talk about that in a minute. They are transported and cached in the ground by the Clark's nutcracker. So there's a very close relationship between this bird and the tree and regeneration. And it's a beautiful species. We call this a keystone species. Do you say the same term? Like a species of clave? Clave, yeah. It provide the piñones is a food resource for over 200 animal species, including humans. So it's important for the watershed and preserving the snowpack at the high elevations, and providing food for many animals. Again, it has a large piñone. It is dependent on the Clark's nutcracker. The Confederated, the Salish and the Kootenai and the Pendere indigenous peoples make a soup out of the piñone, and of course they roast them and eat them as well. It's part of many ceremonies, and it's really important species for the indigenous peoples. And bears love the piñones as well. You will not find, it's strange because here, when I go to Malacoayo or Conguillo, you can see the Araucaria piñones on the ground. You'll never find one in Montana. Never. Because they're been eaten. They're all eaten. They're gone. Here's the distribution of whitebark pine in the western U.S. Again, it's a high elevation species. It is in rocky soils. It does very well in very harsh biophysical conditions. And today we're seeing increased competition from two other species of, or three species of trees that are moving up. Many of the threats to the distribution of whitebark pine, we have an introduced disease, blister rust. We have mountain pine beetle, which is native. Competition with those three species, lodgepole pine, Engelmann, spruce, and subalpine fir. Drought is having an effect on the distribution of whitebark pine. And we're looking at how changing fire regimes might be both benefiting and also harming the establishment of whitebark pine. So what we have what is called a disturbance synergy, where we have fires, drying, insect outbreaks, and disease. All of these together are affecting over 50% of the canopy and the distribution of whitebark pine has some level of mortality from the combination of these. And this is an image of, you can see the mortality in the Yellowstone area for whitebark pine. It's having quite an effect there, and it's expanding. The worst effects right now are here, but we are seeing this all throughout the West. This shows, this is a grizzly bear. So the Clark's nutcracker, the bird, buries the piñone, and then the bears come and they dig out, and they get many calories by eating these. One of the interesting things that I have found working with Mauro and Rafael and Hannibal is this similarity between Araucaria and whitebark pine. They're not genetically similar in any way, but their ecological niche and cultural significance, to me, is very similar. You have the large piñones, you have the bird relationship with transporting and caching the piñones. The lower limbs, this is a bad image here because the older whitebark pine, the mature trees, they lose their lower limbs. They are somewhat fire adapted. So as you get older, you can actually withstand fire as a whitebark pine, similar to the older Araucaria. And of course, they're very important to the peoples in Montana and here in Chile as well, in Argentina. One of the interesting things we have found with whitebark pine is our lab, we looked at all of the pollen records for whitebark pine. And this here is, again, a paleoecological record going from today, present day, to 15,000 years ago. And if you look at the abundance of whitebark pine pollen, it is highest between 12 and 8,000 years ago. And this was at a time where you had very high fire activity. The highest fire activity during the Holocene for these areas coincided with the highest distribution of whitebark pine, or the highest abundance. It also occurred prior to the arrival of the mountain pine beetle, which arrived around 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 years ago. It also coincided with a decline in some of its main competitors. You see an increase in subalpine fir, and also Douglas fir and some of the other pines. So it was a very dominant feature of the landscape for many thousands of years, and it started and then started declining as you have the mountain pine beetle and more competition from other species and a decrease in fire activity. So we think, we know that whitebark pine can benefit from fire, but it's, well, I'll explain this in the next slide. The first thing we want to do is just better understand what is the relationship between establishment and the distribution of whitebark pine and fire. And again, we know there is some relationship, but we don't have many records to evaluate this. What kind of fire regime promotes the best establishment? And what kind of defenses does whitebark pine have against some of these other disturbances? And one of the things that intrigues us is that when we look at the conceptual work done by Mauro and Thomas Veblen and others in Villarrica and in Chile, is that we think that this kind of successional pattern that Araucaria has with low severity fires and high severity fire, I think the other way around here, high severity fires and low severity fires is really similar for whitebark pine. So at long time scales, you have a fire, whitebark pine needs fire to clear out the competition and establish. This can be every 500 years or 1,000 years even. If you get a fire, that will keep whitebark pine on the landscape, similar to Araucaria in some situations. So we like this conceptual model for whitebark pine, so we're stealing it from it. Just some images of the stands. My student is working in this stand of whitebark pine that much of this has died. You can see the blister rust. And he is comparing live trees with dead trees. And I'm curious to know if you were doing any of this kind of work here, looking at the resin. I guess you don't have much native resin production.
In Araucaria you have it.
Yeah,
Yeah, but I don't know of any study in the Rafael.
So we have paired plots of dead trees and live trees. These are paired to look at how the live trees are different than the dead trees. This again is this interesting site where you have a lot of competition from those other species, Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir and lodgepole pine. And so we're looking at how the number and area of resin ducts vary between the live tree, the trees that survived and the trees that died. And also the growth rings, that's something that is done very well here for many tree species, looking at gender chronological records and growth. And this is very new results. We just have this from 2 weeks ago. And basically what we see, so we have present here on the x-axis back to 1900. And these are the live trees, and these are the dead trees. And what the green shows is that the more investment into resin ducts, the overall area is green. If you invest more into growth, then it's red. So the dead trees invested all their energy into growing fast. And they did not survive, especially most of the trees are dying between 1980 and 2000. So what we see is the trees that invest into more and larger resin ducts are surviving different disturbances, drought and mountain pine beetle attacks and fire. So this is just another plot. This is a conditional density plot. So the black is dead trees, and the live is the gray. And this is, so the probability of survival increases when you have greater resin duct area. So you can see how the live trees have much larger relative area per tree than the dead trees. So this is interesting. It's been found in other species, but never on high elevation species like whitebark pine. And so we think that the investment into resin ducts is a very important defense against these disturbance synergies, these combinations of disturbances. Okay, so just repeating what I just said, I guess one of the most important things is that from a management perspective, knowing that the amount of investment into resin ducts is hereditary, this could be used for reseeding and selecting different types of trees for the future. Okay, I'm just going to talk about one more example of a change that we're seeing in Montana, and this is the expansion of woody expansion. I don't know if you have a similar term here, if it's a phenomenon. Okay.
The greening.
The greening, yeah. So you have greening in a lot of regions of the globe, and a lot of this can be accounted for with CO2 fertilization and the effect on water use efficiency. So you get greater efficiency in your use of water with more CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is especially true for semi-arid regions of the world. In this part of Montana, we are getting a little bit of an increase in precipitation in the winter. Of course, we're having a longer growing season. And then we have a history of fire suppression in here. Now, these variables are different wherever you go on the globe, but you can see a very significant increase in the expansion of woody biomass around the world. And it depends on where you are, which of these is most important. In Montana, it's all of these. And you can just see examples of this woody expansion all over Montana. This is the amount of greening we're seeing in the northern grasslands, Montana right here. And prior to the 20th century, we had a lot of indigenous burning across the landscape. And even without CO2 fertilization, we had burning would turn the forest back into savanna or grassland. And now we have, the 20th century, we don't have indigenous burning, and that also facilitated a lot of expansion of woody biomass. Now, obviously, this has an impact on fire severity. Having more of the woody fuel increases the intensity of fires. And you have a similar pattern here this is Coyhaique Alto. This is not, this is a pine plant, invasion, and that Rafa and Anibal are looking at in their lab. It has a similar impact on fire severity. What's amazing for Montana is that if you look at models, it shows almost a complete shift from grasslands. This is almost all grasslands, to a complete shift to a forested or shrubland forest mixed environment. This will have a very significant impact on the carbon cycle and fire severity. Now, this does not account for if we have more fire. This could go back the other way. So we're very interested in testing different scenarios to see what will happen if we have more fire or different types of management. Right now, it's all going this way, but there are many interactions that could send it back the other way. just like the work done here in Annibal's lab, as you get more woody expansion across the landscape, you get a change in fire severity. But in Montana, if we have more fires, it can go back. So you have these feedbacks where you get more woody expansion and you can get more seeding and a further expansion, like you see in parts, the Estepa in Patagonia. But if we introduce fire, or we have many more fires in Montana, we could see it go back this way. But right now, the models are saying it's going this way. So we want to test this. This is the landscape we're working in. These are all new cohorts, new trees. So you can see the scale of new trees is very large. And we had a fire last year called the Lodgepole Complex Fire, which was over 110,000 hectares. And much of this was the new fuel. Now the question is, are we going to have more of these, many more, and we go back to grassland, or are we going to expect more of these severe fires? So, the overall conclusion, if I go back up to a large scale, we're seeing very dynamic change to our climate system, to fire regimes, and our disturbance regimes. And the major conclusion is that we're going to see in these regions, both the western United States and Chile, central Chile, an increase in fire activity in the future. But the effects on the ecosystems are going to vary depending on where you are and of course on the people. So that is all I have. Muchas gracias.
Okay. Muchas gracias, David, por una charla tan interesante, los videos tan elocuentes. ¿Preguntas o comentarios que quieran hacer? Callado. Yo tengo una, el origen de los, the origin, the ignition, in the case of the fires in the US and Canada. But,
well, we have a lot of lightning. It's different than here. So, well, I won't show it, but if you look at the distribution of natural ignitions, it is the same as human ignitions, and it's very high for the fire season. June, July, August, we have, throughout the western United States, we have a lot of natural and human ignitions. And if you take the human ignitions away, we have plenty to keep the fire.
50%, you say half and half?
Yeah, it's actually, if you look at the distribution, it's somewhere around there.
Yeah. Okay.
But even if you have only half, it's enough for...
Yeah. Lo que yo le pregunté era el origen de los incendios, ¿verdad? Que en Chile es más del 99% por causa humana. Yo digo es 50 y 50 por rayos y 50 por acción humana. Y que incluso quitando la influencia humana todavía había mucho incendio, suficiente incendio por rayos. Ahora sí.
You can ask in Spanish.
Sí, la densidad de población humana en Montana, en esa zona, a lo mejor es mucho menor que en Chile. Entonces, el efecto de la intervención humana es baja.
Could you...
Yeah, the population density in Montana compared to the regions where you get fires in Chile.
It's very low. Yeah, it's...
What's the total population in
1 million
Montana?
in all of Montana.
1 million?
Yeah, and they are concentrated in the sea level.
And maybe Montana is like how many square miles in Montana?
Let's see.
Maybe a third of Chile or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. 1 millón de personas más o menos en el tercio del territorio de Chile. Tu estado grande.
Yeah, it's very different in terms of ignitions here because CONAF, the records say like 98% human ignitions, and most of your ignitions from lightning are in the Andes, high, and maybe a little in the coast range, but very few natural ignitions here. Any other questions? You can ask in Spanish and translate.
¿Cómo se espera que cambie el ciclo de carbono con este cambio desde los pastizales a más arbustivo, pero luego este ciclo de fuego más rápido?
Tú dices a nivel, solo pensando allá donde lo mostramos.
Sí, en este cambio, sí, lo que hayan estudiado, pero a veces tenemos mayor captura, imagino, pero después se libera todo de nuevo, plazo mediano, largo.
Buena pregunta. Did you get that one? About the carbon cycling, because you get lots of emissions with the, lots of sequestration and uptake because of the CO2 fertilization, but then you release the carbon due to the fires. How do you see that in the mid-time or long time?
It's very complicated temporally because you can choose. There's been some nice work by one of my colleagues, and you choose a fire here or there. Your carbon cycle completely changes where you pick the window. So the length of succession between a fire event in a forested setting versus a grassland is very important, because grasslands sequester carbon, forests sequester carbon, but it's how many fires over 1,000 years in both grassland and fire determines how much carbon is emitted. And so I think you can have a grassland that sequesters a lot of carbon with annual fires every year because most of it is below ground. And if you're going to sequester carbon with a forest, you have to have a few fires, maybe every 100 years or more, if it's woody burning, right? Mm-hmm. So in a Pinus ponderosa, or it's not burning the trees, it's burning the grass. In those types of forests, and the same with araucaria. And when you have a fire in open araucaria, it's burning the understory. So you're not losing the carbon from the mature trees. It's very complicated, but if you have a lot of fire and you burn a lot of forests, the carbons, it's really bad. A lot of CO2.
But you also release the carbon from the soil in the fires. ¿Se entendió la explicación o no? Que dependía de la ventana de tiempo que se considerara, pero esto altera completamente el balance de carbono, y él decía muy distinto si es un incendio que solamente quema la estrata herbácea, por ejemplo esos bosques abiertos de pino ponderosa o de araucaria, o si realmente se queman los árboles, entonces emite mucho más carbono. Yo le hice el comentario que de todas maneras cuando hay quema de estos pastizales hay liberación del carbono del suelo.
I will add one thing. I think even though it's complicated, one conclusion that people have made is that if we have fewer or more frequent low severity fires, it's better for the carbon cycle.
Si hay incendios de menor severidad, digamos, más frecuente, eso sería mejor para el ciclo de carbono, más o menos intuitivo.
Sí.
Es más alterado un ciclo, un régimen de incendio, o sea, ya lo peor que puede haber, yo realmente, I'm really surprised with what you're showing, más frecuente y de mayor severidad, como decimos cuando se te acaba el combustible, si vas con ese, y más extenso. Es como contraintuitivo, porque normalmente, ¿no es cierto?, si hay incendios más frecuentes o de menor severidad, son también de menor tamaño. Y como los dos regímenes que nosotros conocíamos hasta ahora opuestos, muchos incendios chicos, frecuentes, ¿no es cierto?, o grandes incendios de grande superficie y severos cada muchos años. ¿Más preguntas o comentarios?
Very interesting your talk. I was wondering, you mentioned the expansion of the Hadley cell, right? And therefore we're going to have drier days during the summer, or during the whole year, I guess. So, you also mentioned the correlation between the high temperature and the fires.
Yeah.
Is there also a relationship or a projection for the winds? What's the role the winds are going to play on these fire occurrences or fire expansion, I guess? Because it's, I assume that the wind is very important during the event of the...
Muy complicado. The wind is very muy complicado. Because the jet stream, some people say the high jet stream is going to slow down. Some say, it's supposed to slow down with increasing temperature and water vapor. But the low-level jet, and the phone winds, the Puelche winds, and some people think they will get more extreme because the gradient between land and ocean is higher, so that you have a higher gradient between high and low pressure. So the more small-scale winds are supposed to be more extreme, but the larger scale, maybe a decrease in the jet stream or the high-level winds. So it's very complicated. But I think in California, we've seen the gradient between the land surface and the ocean is increased. So it fuels more intense wind. But someone will tell me I'm wrong, but I think that is what I've heard are the projections for. In California, these types of events are going to get more extreme. Just the basic physics, but at the global scale, it's different. So.
Yeah. Algo más, Luis? Yeah, maybe a question regarding to that. Do you know of any, or otherwise it's a take-home for us at work, of a couple models on ecosystem or a source where you can find information? For a couple of ecosystem and the climate models related to fire, with the biomass accumulation and carbon emissions and that kind of, and the wind, the global circulation that you were commenting.
Yeah, I mean, I can
jet stream and lower.
I can forward. I have some papers.
But in NOAA or in somewhere, you think there?
Yeah, I mean, I have not seen great projections for like fire and carbon so much. There's a group that has been working. Van der Graaf has done a little modeling with global fire and carbon, but I've only seen these in a couple papers, not from NOAA.
I see.
Yeah, or even I can't give you a website, but I could give you the papers.
Okay.
But if you want to forward them or email, I can give you my email. I can send them to you.
Yeah, thanks.
But I actually don't have a website. I could say go here if you want to see the results. Cause
no,
I don't know.
Yeah. Entender esa parte, como hubo dos preguntas relacionadas con eso, hay algunos modelos, ¿verdad? Lo que se llama modelos acoplados de ecosistemas con la atmósfera. Entonces, por ejemplo, nuestro colega Jonathan Barichevich, que estuvo acá como postdoc 2 años y ahora está en Francia, y otro postdoc se dedica a eso. Trabajan en redes, pero eso en desarrollo. Entonces yo le preguntaba si conocía de algunos modelos o sitios de web, me dijo que no, pero él tenía un par de papers y los podía compartir si envía. Your email was shown in the first slide or not?
No, I can.
But you can, lo pueden encontrar en el David McWethy, ¿no es cierto?, en la Universidad de Montana. Lo pueden encontrar, ¿sí?
Yo quisiera hacer un comentario en español.
Sí.
Sorry. Spanish.
No se entiende. No va despacio.
Yo creo que y un comentario más que una consulta, porque el tema de la planificación territorial o la desplanificación territorial, que no como uno de los factores más importantes, a lo mejor desde el punto de vista en Chile para la ocurrencia de incendios, en donde por una parte la gente está adentro del bosque, sin gente urbana, sin conciencia, ¿cómo se llama?, ambiental muchas veces y tampoco de protección, segundas casas muchas veces, en donde también tenemos que los principales incendios que se producen en Chile, los más connotados, son básicamente la parte periurbana, donde la gente va a vivir a cualquier parte, y todo eso pasa por una desregulación territorial que tenemos en nuestro país y que seguramente ahí va la pregunta respecto a Montana. Yo me acuerdo de los incendios de un par de años atrás en California, donde se quemaban todas las casas de los famosos con las piscinas ahí, que seguramente en Chile puede ser una zona de preservación ecológica. Allá misma cosa, o sea, mientras tenga el tipo las lucas, se hace donde sea, y quedó de incendio, no había ni un grifo, no había agua, no había como ya con los bomberos, se quemó todo. Bueno, acá pasa algo más o menos parecido, y es por lo mismo, porque la gente dentro del bosque, y por otro lado también el bosque acercándose a la gente, en el sentido de que ya hoy las empresas forestales no solamente están ocupando los suelos de capacidad forestal, sino que están en las clases 3, clases 2, donde el suelo se acerca el bosque hacia el centro poblado. ¿Por qué lo digo esto? Porque obviamente en nuestro país, a diferencia de allá, que no tenemos tantos rayos y cosas así, aquí mayormente la gente que produce el incendio. Entonces, por más que podamos colocar las fichas en CONAF, en los aviones, en los tanques y toda la cuestión, finalmente la parte de prevención y la parte de regulación territorial, a mi juicio, deben ser consideradas como las más importantes. Bueno, dicho toda esta peyorata, la pregunta es la siguiente. ¿Cómo lo hacen allá en Estados Unidos respecto a la gente que quiere irse a vivir dentro del campo como una segunda casa, sabiendo que eventualmente ahí tenemos un riesgo latente de que puede ocurrir un incendio? ¿Le colocan algún tipo de impuesto extra a esa casa? ¿Le hacen algún tipo de capacitación? ¿O la gente solamente puede irse a vivir donde quiera con todas las consecuencias que podría traer?
So you're asking what regulations do people have to around their houses and
I mean, to go and live within the forest, in areas of high fire hazard.
Well,
like urban, like dispersed rural-urban interface, not concentrated one.
yeah, well, I mean,
Scattered houses in the forest.
we have very few regulations, and it's a big problem. I mean, problem. I think we're working on this now because we're losing communities like in Santa Rosa and Paradise, and this is similar to Santa Olga here. We have the same thing happening, and we have no. I mean, you can't have a fire when it's very dry, but when you drive a car, the sparks from the car or the train, or we still have fires, accidental, and it's a big problem because these communities, the wildlife urban interface, but even beyond that, we have houses everywhere, and we have these many programs we call Firewise to reduce the fuel. So people are supposed to cut the fuel around the house, but right now it's not working so well. It's not required. But we are actually writing right now of the best examples in the United States of communities that have done something to protect themselves. And there's a few really good, very good examples, but very few. We have many communities that are moving into, and we have the drying, and it's like, even if you can stop intentional fire, even if you can stop that, it's not going to help in United States, because we still have enough ignitions that in a windy, hot day, you get an accidental. So I mean, of course, I know here, Mauro and others tell me there are a lot of intentional fires, and maybe that would help a little bit, but I still think you have to protect the community by managing the fuels. Like Santa Olga, I know the new houses now, there should be a buffer. It's okay to have the plantations, but there should be some buffer, like between the house and the tree, the first group of trees. So the same in California. But it's a big problem where we are. It's
¿Hay más preguntas? Sí.
Gracias. Sé que no tiene la esfera de Brujo, pero después de la experiencia del año 17, los incendios, ¿cómo ve él el futuro de nuestros bosques de Araucaria? Los incendios que hubo en los
en
bosques.
2017, perdón.
Claro.
Sí, entendiste la pregunta, ¿verdad? ¿Cómo ves? Dice,
Yes.
you don't have the how to say, glass for the wizards see the future. But anyway, how do you see the future of the Araucaria forest after the 2017 fire in Chile?
well, I mean, I think we have colleagues that are working on this. Andres Holtz from Portland State is working with Andres Fuentes from Universidad de Frontera, and Rafa and others are looking at this question. So maybe we'll have him step in. But I think, I think the important part is you have a healthy Araucaria forest in Argentina and Chile, and they are starting to be eaten on the sides by fire and when you have Pinus contorta and cattle. So you have the cows, the vaca, and the fire. And in Argentina, Thomas Veblen showed me the sites where they're now so dry that when you have a disturbance, the Araucaria will not regenerate. So the eating from the outside of the last remaining stands is a threat. It's dangerous. But I think if we protect the outside, Araucaria will be fine. But Rafa, can you add?
Sí, es claro que, por lo que nos mostraba el clima está siendo más seco y es cuestión de tiempo que volvamos a tener incendios nuevamente en estos bosques de Araucaria y la tendencia es clara, vamos a tener, es un hecho. Ahora la capacidad de esos bosques que tengan para recuperarse va a depender mucho de lo que nosotros hacemos después. Probablemente no podamos evitar que se vuelvan a quemar, pero sí podemos hacer mucho para que se puedan regenerar de la manera adecuada, evitando que entre el ganado, reduciendo el piñoneo, evitando que la gente entre y eliminando la invasión de pino con torta y de otros pinos que están entre medio para que sean condiciones más naturales para cuando vuelva a ocurrir un incendio. Esa es la tarea que tenemos, no podemos evitar, y tampoco no tenemos la capacidad de predecir tampoco cuándo y dónde va a ocurrir un incendio, pero tener estos bosques mejor preparados y aumentar su resiliencia es lo que sí podemos hacer.
Gracias, Rafael. Sí, Jacqueline.
Bueno, hacía mención de varias variables que son las que intervienen en lo que es el triángulo del fuego. De acuerdo a los que manejaban, en la que probablemente nosotros podríamos tener control o manejo es sobre el combustible. ¿Hay algún manejo que se realice al combustible o cuál es el punto de quiebre para que digan este es un factor de ignición o no? ¿Está en riesgo de que se queme esta área o no? De acuerdo a la carga de combustible.
The in the triangle for has to do with the fire load. So there is some criteria like to set up a threshold or something like that, so you can say the risk or the hazard, the fire hazard, according to the fuel load and some management, the rules for that.
Yeah, I think I don't know if there's a national fuel load map.
En Chile, pero se podría, sí existe, ¿verdad? Sí, pero muy grueso.
Sí, muy grueso, sí.
So,
el profe de Chile se llama
Julio, y eso es Julio, sí, pero de 20 años más, 40
But you could prepare one. There are carbon, for example, or at least if someone tells you, I want it for next week, because there are the coefficients, given certain vegetation type, they have the range of fire loads, so you could do it.
Well, I actually, there's a new paper out by a group that I reviewed the paper and it was
From
published.
Chile?
Yeah,
Oh,
it's a mix, half Chileans and half Americans.
oh.
It was published in the Bureau of Meteorological Society. And it is a model, it's a fire risk model for Chile. And it uses humidity and temperature, and I think has a fuel layer or some. It's
And it's already published?
Yeah.
You could please tell us.
Yeah, I'll send that to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, yeah.
And you see,
Yeah, a bit of Spanish. So.
Sí.
Mencionaste there was a relation between the radial growth and there were more dead trees that made. Entonces, is there other kind of management other than just selection to promote the more growth of cinematic green? ¿Cómo es lo cinematic?
sí, no, pues era lo.
Eso, como para incentivar más crecimiento de tubos en vez de crecimiento radial.
Ah, pero ¿qué tipo de tratamiento manejo dices tú?
Claro, porque él
Claro.
hablaba solamente de selección, ¿no?
Sí.
Como
Sí.
selección.
So you get it if you could through
Is there other
management.
kind of
No,
No?
Creo que only selection for the hereditary.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
think there's another. We don't. It's so variable in nature. Which tree has more area of resin ducts? You can't tell until you cut and look. So
Yeah.
in the genetics, you can tell.
Yeah.
But so we don't.
But may I ask
Oh,
a question
yeah,
regarding that? That resin, I mean, it's more, how to say, combustible than the, and you showed it with the pine plantations compared to the eucalypt plantations in the risk in your paper, about the fire risk, the probability of fire. But so how it protects it to, how to say, to the, how it helps resilience after fires
Yes.
or wounds or disease.
It does not directly help fight with
Uh-huh.
fire, but the tree is healthier because it is protected from drought and insects, so it has more water in the tree.
I see.
But yeah, it's indirect.
Yeah.
It's not the resin
If it
is,
burns, it's bad.
but it can have thicker bark, so
Ajá.
you have a healthy tree. It has more protection to fire.
Ah, sí. Ya, yo lo que le pregunté era cómo parecía una contradicción de tener canales resiníferos, era más, era, digamos, protegida contra el fuego, las enfermedades, etc. Entonces, lo que él contestó es que digamos que eso hacía que el árbol estuviera más sano, con una corteza más gruesa y la madera más húmeda, que resistiendo mejor a la sequía, y que eso entonces lo hacía más resistente al fuego y a las enfermedades. ¿Quién ha visto otro árbol en Chile, aparte de la araucaria, ese que se le aparte del pino, por supuesto, que le salga la resina? Es lo único que me acuerdo. Que a veces uno los taladra, por ejemplo, la araucaria empieza a llorar la
I
resina.
think did Alex Fajardo?
¿Ya?
He studied the big insect disturbance in Juan Poritzis in Argentina. And I
Yeah,
don't-
in Nosophagus.
Yeah, but there's no defense, right? No defense for the tree.
I think there's no resin en la lengua latina, ¿no es cierto? Nada que se parezca, ¿no? Ya. ¿Hay más preguntas o si no, le damos sí?
Just a quick one. Thank you for your presentation. It's easy to follow. When they were discussing about the territorial planning, I would like to know what is your recommendation based on the studies and the experiences that you have during this whole time of your research. What is the minimum that you could recommend for the buffer from the forest plantation to the urban area or where there's settlement?
Well, I mean, there has been many studies that have looked at this home defensible zone, and even 300 meters of no fuel or low fuel can be very beneficial, but the problem is when you have very extreme conditions. There's been new studies after California fires that you have the embers going in the vents of the house. So even from far away, the wind is so strong. It sends the embers in the inside of the house and starts a fire. And so we have to think anew of how to construct a house, how to make the vents, because when you have winds of kilometers, it changes everything, because now the house becomes a fuel. When you have low winds, the house, it's okay. But now, I think if you, there's many studies that show even 100 meters to 300 meters, you manage the fuels around a house, it's going to help. But when you get really strong winds, then everything changes.
Okay.
So now we're saying you should have communities that have these community defense zones, which are larger and have green, different construction, and you protect against the embers, and the roof should be fireproof metal or, So we have to think, especially in these areas where you get the Diablo and the Santa Ana winds and the Puebla winds, we have to think about how to build a house anew.
A bunker.
Yeah.
Underground bunker. Rafael, ¿tú quieres agregar algo?
No.
No. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Muchas
Thank you very
gracias.
much, David. Muchas gracias. Muy buena la presentación. Gracias, Luis.
Yeah.
Bueno.